Okay, we're going to jump right back into this because, as you can tell, we have a very packed agenda and we're doing a pretty good job of staying on track. I'm just going to be really brief up here because this is another really thoughtful conversation with some amazing thinkers up here, where we're going to talk about rethinking investment and impact in research. We have folks here from the national stage. We have folks who do work on international, as well as down here all the way local to the state of Colorado. We're going to talk about what's been changing, what's been shifting, what are some new models to think about when it comes to both public investment, private investment, philanthropic investment, partnership. And so it's both talking about the reality, but also speaking really innovative about the future. And I'm really excited for that. So we have four great speakers here. We have Cristin Dorgelo. She works at the intersection of government capacity and the future of U.S. research and innovation. She served as senior advisor for the management in the Office of Management and Budget in the White House during the Biden administration, and she previously served as chief of staff and assistant director for the Office of Science and Technology Policy. We also have Justin Milner, so I'm jumping around. These are not in order. You got photos there to help. He is the executive vice president of evidence and evaluation for Arnold Ventures, where he leads a cross-cutting portfolio on evidence-based policy and evaluation, overseeing research investment designed to move social interventions along the evidence continuum. He's got over 20 years experience spanning the nonprofit, philanthropic, and public sectors, including serving as vice president for research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. We also have Dan Powers, who's a longtime dear friend and partner of ours here at the Institute, has helped advise on that science and technology policy fellowship program you all have heard us talk about. I want to make a quick plug that our fellows are actually here today, so keep your eyes out for them. I don't know if they'll be able to be here all day because session is in, but they are here for some of the day. Dan leads CoLabs. For those of you who are not familiar, CoLabs is a critically important institution here in our state. It is a Colorado nonprofit representing more than 30 federally funded research labs, university institutes, technology companies, and economic development organizations. He's got over 25 years of experience in policy assessment and public engagement, and he champions the role of taxpayer-funded scientific research as a foundation of innovation and America's global competitiveness. And last but definitely not least, the person who'll be guiding us through today's conversation is Jesus Salazar. Many of you know Jesus. He's a sixth-generation Coloradan, a seasoned technology executive with over 20 years experience at companies including Microsoft, Amgen, and Yamaha. He co-founded Pico AI, which uses artificial intelligence to transform commercial building management. And he chairs Prosono, which is a social impact consulting firm. And Andrea is here from Prosono, and I really loved working with Prosono recently. And he also serves as chairman emeritus of the board of trustees at the Colorado School of Mines, and he is an advisor to the Institute for Science and Policy and serves on our board. Jesus, thank you for being here. I'll let you take it over from here.
Great. Thanks, Cristin. So first of all, so thrilled to be having this very timely conversation. You know, our session is going to focus on pivotal tension, right? We have federal funding being cut. Well, our social needs are certainly not slowing down. I think a lot of people would agree, maybe even accelerating. You take that, you take the politicization that's going on, and I think a sense that there's a complication in that federal funding, the purpose of federal funding is somewhat contested for research, right? Some think it's for economic empowerment. Some think it's for the pursuit of knowledge and all the virtues that come to that. Some think it's for national security. That adds to complication and further creates these gaps that you see public-private philanthropy continuing to try and fill those gaps. You know, we're gonna continue to unpack this, but my hope is we're not just gonna talk about budget cuts today, right? Like with most change, there's tons of opportunity if you're willing to weather the shock and look past that. And hopefully we'll unpack some of those today. So hopefully looking for a very lively discussion. I thought to start, we would just give a lay of the land here. So first question will go to Cristin. So Cristin, you know, from your very broad vantage point, you know, whether it's federal budget, philanthropy, or the lab ecosystem, I mean, how would you characterize what's happening out there today, the shifting funding landscape and what's currently being navigated?
Okay, so this is important, but before I dig into the actual laydown, I want to know who you are to help me understand how to lay it down. How many of you work for an organization that receives federal funding? How many of those are through contracts? How many of those are through grants? Or some other special form, like we heard other transactions authority and cooperative agreements earlier. If you even know what a cooperative agreement is, raise your hand. Oh my gosh. Okay, so this is a pretty informed crowd in terms of how federal funding is changing. And I do want to offer this both as my role as a former Office of Management and Budget official, and also because I spent the last year with some of those budget nerds that came out of the Hill and came out of the Biden administration trying to track what is actually occurring. Because what I will say, it is not as simple as federal funding for research is contracting or federal funding for research is getting cut. It is far more nuanced change than that. So the first thing I would argue is that the system itself for grant making is something we've totally generally not paid enough attention to because it has just been chugging along. There's lots of room to improve it, tons of room to improve it, but it's just been chugging along. And it should now be of high interest to us because it is becoming less efficient, more burdensome. It is becoming more open to corruption, I would argue. It is definitely becoming more politicized per our earlier discussion, but also through the mechanics that are occurring about who is doing what. And most importantly, and I think this is the central word for our conversation, it is becoming more uncertain. And so I'm going to come back to what uncertainty is doing in a minute. So why should we care about this based on the hands that you raised? I don't think I need to convince you, but let's look at grants specifically because that's where we've seen the biggest shift, right? So annually, on average, over the last 10 years, $900 billion flows through federal grants. $130 billion of that, on average, is through competitive grants. I would bet that most of you your organizations are getting competitive grants. And how many of you work for state or local government? Some of you are getting formula and block grants, which, your state or local government is controlling the distribution of. And so another $50 billion is going out through cooperative agreements. And we're not even talking here about federal contracts, right? That's a lot of money. It is money that is being used. The whole system is set up so that the federal government accomplishes the goals Congress sets for it by spending that money on public goods, on what Congress has said it should be spent on. And so when we talk about what's changing in contracting, we know that the top lines of how much money is going to research, right? The top lines are actually staying pretty flat and in some cases slightly increasing. And when you look back at fiscal year 2025, despite how many articles you read about the word impoundment, how many of you have heard the word impoundment for the first time last year? This means illegally withheld. There's actually a pretty small pot of funds, less than 1%, that we think were illegally impounded in terms of funds that were appropriated for fiscal year 2025 and needed to be spent by the end of it, 1 year funds. However, for how many of you was this the most unpredictable year in your federal grant funding ever? Okay, so why is that happening? Well, when you look at the plumbing, you look at every stage of it, pre-award, when the agency is figuring out what program it's going to run, right? In the award, when it's actually deciding whether to approve a payment, when it's deciding who gets an award, post-award, when it's deciding which grantees might need investigation by oversight bodies, or post-award when there might be a dispute in terms of whether to terminate. Every single step of the process, we have documented significant changes occurring across many federal grant-making agencies, not just science. So what is changing is the funding for what? So you can look at the Senate Help Committee minority just put out a report a day or two ago that said $560 million in terminated or frozen assets for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. Those are not words that normally are political, and I would bet you that there was something about those awards that read as more political. We also see in this, and I'll be done here in a second, The changes of by whom and for whom. So who's involved in decision making is changing, and who is receiving awards is changing. And under what conditions? New terms and conditions, strings on grant awards, and also dispute resolution that's happening outside of like the contract. Contracts for grant agreements have terms. You're going to cancel them, you follow that. What's happening instead is executive orders that say University X, if you do not do Y, your contract, your grant is cut, like outside of the standard process for a dispute. So what happens when you have intensive uncertainty in a system is something that I think we're going to talk more about here. And I would argue that grantees and contractors take fewer risks when you have a lot of uncertainty, and reduced risk-taking is bad for science. It's bad for research. We also have fewer researchers getting funded, and we have what I would call self-editing occurring, in which leaders are deciding not to make proposals or ask for money for certain types of research, or are not proactively making infrastructure or personnel investments they would do otherwise. That self-editing is toxic to our innovation ecosystem. The last thing I would say is quantity of awards. So that's actually where the interesting thing is. At NIH alone, nearly 25,000 fewer awards were made in FY 2025 than in FY 2024. And that, to me, makes me very worried about early career researchers. So I think this raises questions for, as we'll talk about, what is philanthropy doing? Because they cannot fill that gap at that volume, I argue. And what is happening within grantee organizations to deal with that degree of uncertainty. So more to talk about, but that's sort of like my basic laydown. It's not cuts, it's uncertainty, and it is disruption, and it is changes in who is getting what money. Okay?
Super helpful, Cristin. Thanks for the laying of the land here.
Yeah.
Dan, maybe to you quickly. I mean, how is all this change feeling, on your end? What are labs saying?
Sure. So I'll stay in this sort of dark place for a little bit, and I'll just add some color commentary to
Dan,
this.
I said that it wasn't about cuts.
Right. So really, to Kristin's point, it's not necessarily the magnitude or non-magnitude of cut, it's the volatility right now, the unpredictability. That's probably the best word to encapsulate where things are now. And in that, a lot of the uncertainty is because of shifts in the political atmosphere and the political structures even, whereby policy priorities are being perhaps articulated, or worse, in essence, implied or left for the audience to try to discern what is it that we're supposed to do or allowed to do. And I've seen that uncertainty really freezes the decision-making process, or let's say it brings things back into the most predictable and small-scale, almost defensible, born of what is perceived to be defensible kind of process for prioritizing whatever scientific research a given entity should be leaning into. We're also seeing, and I'm talking more particularly with federal labs, federally funded labs, or federally funded research entities here in Colorado. There's born of these often executive orders, which are explicitly or otherwise telegraphing what are priorities. That has a ripple effect into the kind of language that can be used or should be used or should not be used when describing a given research priority, how you're going to characterize the next phase of projects that are being worked on. And all of this is having a real chilling effect on, in essence, fundamental or foundational research, where the pivot, has gone in many programs very almost, let's say, pragmatically, is into being able to describe short-term impacts, very tangible impacts of science, and the almost mission pivot for some entities that have a more foundational and long-term horizon research culture that is upending just the whole, let's say, vibe of confidence and vibe of certainty within our taxpayer-funded research labs. The executive orders that I mentioned, there's been at times either contradictory or outright, say, vague, aspirational, but without the language that a given scientist or research laboratory director can understand. Well, what does that mean? And then I'll add or end with this one sort of point. Another reality that's happening that's in the political realm is that in the last year, what had been the historic nexus of power in terms of where appropriation decisions are made and the associated directives on how funding from the federal government would be applied has left Congress. It has gone into the administration, particularly into the Office of Management and Budget, and then under that umbrella, the given different federal agency directors. And the severing over the last 8-12 months now of long-standing relationships. Many of your organizations may have actual lobbyists or otherwise have advocates. We're not lobbyists, but we do nonprofit advocacy for science. The connections in Congress, where you would usually go to the staff of a given committee or to the actual congressperson or senator of committees, they are not the key focus point of where to go. And it has been deeply challenging and frustrating to have a version of being told, well, call this agency, call 1-800-Washington, D.C., and you get no response. It's in some ways, it would at least be helpful to have some direct, what might be considered negative clarity on you can't do this. Instead, it truly is, there is no one to answer the phone. And staff amongst agencies, some of the layoffs that initially were focused on the communications staff or other kinds of public engagement or government relations staff. That is also part of this uncertainty atmosphere that we're still in. And I know I'm in many ways speaking to the choir. You're all like, yes, we don't know who to talk to. We thought you'd know, Dan. That can be the case. So know that since CoLabs also, I'll mention, we're not federally funded. So we've been able to operate in a place over the last 12 months of speaking up for and asking questions and not being fearful. I'll add, again, for federal employees, there's outright directives on what you can't say or talk about. And then there's just a lot of implied, don't talk about such and such. And so getting things behind the scenes from people via emails or personal cell phone conversations, et cetera, that clunkiness has also really gummed up the application of what might still be a higher level of funding. But there's so many questions about how it can be applied. And these broken chains of communication are another real challenge for us.
That's great, Dan. Justin, how has your job changed in, the last several months, and how is Arnold Ventures and philanthropy at large responding?
So I want to just say I thought these first two observations were just outstanding. Like that synthesis of what is happening at this level and behind the front page, what is actually happening in page 2, 3, 4 through 6, what's happening in the plumbing. This idea that I think so many of us were hit by the wave of Doge. It's been interesting that Doge hasn't been mentioned, but it was such a cataclysmic tsunami in DC and washed over the bureaucracy, washed over all the work of agencies, and led to so many changes. And yet there has been pushback. And yet the budgets that were asked for in the president's 2026 budget request, that's not what he got. The cuts of 40, 50%, as Cristin said, were actually basically at level of previous years for what Congress approved. So I think it's really important to hold these things in hand, even as, the funding uncertainty is extremely real. The hollowing out that Dan described is extremely real. And just one anecdote of that is, at Arnold Ventures, we support social science. We work closely with the Institute of Education Sciences. This is the Department of Education, and they support evaluations as well as help to run the National Assessment of Education Progress. People probably know this, like the nation's scorecard. So when you see fourth graders not doing as well as fourth graders were 5 years ago, that's the scorecard. Institute of Education Sciences in January of last year had about 100 people. In March, it had 3. And so this idea that funding cuts may not be happening, but the hollowing out and the expertise and the capacity to direct, to support, and to maintain the research infrastructure, that's very much at risk. And that's the kind of thing that's not sexy, and it's not making the headlines, but it's the kind of thing that has really lasting effects. So to answer your question, how has my job changed? Not dramatically, but philanthropies are weird, right? Philanthropies are almost like these odd castles unto themselves. We're not connected to the market. We're not connected to government. We don't have elected people. We have a board, and we may have living donors that we're really trying to reflect those values. And so it's very easy for philanthropy to be disconnected. But I will say that I think over this last year, philanthropies generally have been scared, have been really hit by this. And what you've seen across the field is a retrenchment in some ways, is a scrubbing of bodies of work, and even an ending of bodies of work that feel like they might be counter to the priorities of the administration. And that's really surprising because, again, if you go to the castle analogy, usually surrounded by a moat, and we are buffered from these kind of political headwinds. Okay, I mixed the metaphor, but we're usually not as attuned to that, and you are seeing philanthropies really changing there. I will say in my day-to-day, the biggest thing has been, as a research funder, working with research organizations to manage through this uncertainty and thinking about ways that both we can be supportive in short term, but are probably not going to be able to provide the necessary supports over the long term. And so that has been a lot of calls, a lot of meetings, and a lot of thinking about what that might look like going forward.
Can I have one quick follow-up on this? So I think this point that Justin just made about the retrenchment in philanthropy, I want to say one word about the why. So you talked about the moat. And when conflict resolution is happening through coercion from the federal government that involves naming of individual organizations for attention on things like tax status, retrenchment is understandable, right? Some caution there, because it is hard to predict when your organization is going to be targeted by being named either on a blacklist or a gray list. And that cannot be understated, how much that colors the view of decision makers at the highest levels when they're figuring out how much to stand in to response versus thinking about maybe we'll just plan for what comes after all of this disruption is over. That feels safer. So I appreciated you making that point, Justin.
Super great to kind of get the lay of the land here and the perspective. I want to shift to maybe new and emerging models, right? How are people adapting to this, moving forward? Cristin, maybe let's just start with you. What are you seeing out there that, and maybe just some color on what you think is really promising, some things you're seeing that you think are misguided or maybe you're not too hopeful about?
I'm really going to try to bring the optimism, folks. And so let's talk about universities first, because a lot of you, I think, have connections to universities. I think that one of the things that has happened when I've been talking with presidents and chancellors and vice presidents for research over the course of this past year is that they've been trying to sort out how do these research changes fit in the broader perceptions and changing trust in higher ed? And like these are two interconnected things. In October 2025, Pew put out research that noted that 7 in 10 Americans think higher ed is going in the wrong direction. Higher ed is more than research. However, when that same survey explored which areas about higher ed did Americans think universities were doing a good job, right? Like it's not as simple as they think universities are doing a bad job everywhere. The only area where Americans on the whole said they thought universities were doing a good, very good, or excellent job, more than 50%, was research and innovation, 55%. The next highest area, which happened to be providing students with a wide range of opinions, was all the way down at 41%. Only 41% thought universities were being good at that. Way down at the bottom, tuition costs, 12% of Americans think we're in an okay place. So university leaders, in looking at disruption in research, have to take into account the fact that the public does not trust them the same way they used to on an array of issues. So the encouraging thing for us in science and people who are based in universities doing research is university leaders and boards notice this number, that research and innovation is still appreciated by a majority of the public. And they are investing in institutional transformations that allow public impact research, which I'm using as a jargony phrase, to capture a variety of approaches researchers have been experimenting with over the recent decades to increase the public good yield per dollar of what they're doing. So that might be community engaged research, where universities are partnering with the public to answer the public's questions about informing a research agenda with public voice or involving the public in research. They might be the translational and use-inspired areas of research that NSF is increasingly supporting, where really thinking about the development phase, not just the basic research phase. Now, obviously, caveat, that means we might see some decreases in basic research, as was previewed earlier. And also this translation of research to policy programs and practices. The state of Colorado has science and technology fellows embedded in its legislature, thanks to some of the work at the Institute and the museum here and philanthropic partners on that front. There is like a growing knowledge about what is the infrastructure way that a university actually, through its research teams, increases its relationship and beneficial output for the public. And so leaders are not ignorant of that and are attempting to double down and seek philanthropic capacity for that shift towards having more to say about the public good that's coming out of research. So
Cristin, real
leaving
quick-
it at that. Yeah.
Quick on that, so my experience in higher ed, as chair of R1 research institution at Mines, and what's kind of hard is that that dynamic of research being the most valued side for society in universities is kind of crossways with the model, right?
Yes.
Because research is, if you're lucky, it's sustainable. Usually you're just kind of under sustainability and there's this gap. So it's not doing any favors on your P&L for university, right? It comes from students and enrollments and providing education. And so it's really kind of a crossroads. It makes a really tough dynamic.
And saying that inside of that, even when you start to do research that is yielding public impact, your accounting systems are not set up for your work with community partners. Like there's like all sorts of nerdy administrative reasons why universities are not positioned today to do what we're talking about.
Even just the tenureship process, right?
Yeah.
I mean, all of the incentives in play are to publish novel, but not publish unimpactful.
And notice the word publish was just used like 3 times,
4 times.
as opposed to other types of verbs that could be valued in an incentive process.
So let's talk about other models. I mean, what are you seeing out there? Where's the innovation happening?
Okay, so I'm going to give a couple and then see what my colleagues here have to offer. So specifically, I used to work on grand challenges, which are often like nationwide research initiatives. And grand challenges don't have to be nationwide or global or cost $4 billion the way that the President's Brain Initiative did, started by President Obama, although they yield awesome results. But locally, universities have been playing with these goal-oriented public-private partnerships that let them partner with policymakers and with philanthropy and with the public on trying to like solve a hard goal that might be around addiction or it might be around an environmental issue. And just having a shared agenda of what is it that we're trying to accomplish is helping universities walk backward into partnerships that they might not otherwise achieve, longer standing relationships that might help to build trust, and hopefully for all of us, actual research breakthroughs on some really thorny regional issues. Universities are often well positioned to pursue that. And so I think for me, that type of model where we're actually bringing sectors together and thinking regionally and locally has a lot of promise. I have more, but I want to hear from these guys too on what exciting models are emerging.
I'll add
No,
one.
Dan has one.
I know I'll add just a couple that I have seen in other parts of the country, and otherwise just conceptually something for us to focus on, really building on what you were just describing, Cristin, the notion of a science commons. So it's a sort of intentional regional collaboration amongst, in essence, usual suspects, things research universities, economic development organizations, and federal labs. But with a science commons concept, you would look for federal government infrastructure investment. So the sort of big lift to get things started is getting substantial federal investment to provide what might be the actual building, perhaps actual equipment, maybe some startup funding. But we've seen that, and I would put it back to Jesus to describe perhaps more of the like Elevate Quantum example. We also have the NSF's Ascend engine that is centered in Fort Collins, and that entity is sourced by federal funds, but it's a very intentional, robust network of those entities that I was just describing. And the difference here, so I don't want to lose the thread of, these are not fundamental research, long-term decade-long horizons of discovery. So sort of caveat to that, that is still there to be maintained, or otherwise is something that we could lose as a country. But back to the value of something that we could call a science commons, there's a focus on nurturing startups, actually leveraging discoveries into tangible results that will create companies, that will create actionable solutions, think jobs. And that is where the scope of, say, agreement and participation seems to be getting some more gravity, and it can build on itself that way. Ideally, those kind of engines like the NSF has set up are also replicable models, and I know that's a big part of the vision for the NSF engine in Fort Collins, is that their structure very intentionally was meant to be something that other places in the country could look at, and with some seed funding from the federal government, manifest the same kind of regional impact that we'll likely have been seeing here in Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico.
And Dan, you just described perfectly the playbook of Elevate Quantum and the federal funds that came to us, what they're used for, right? We've got a 70-acre campus out in Arvada. We're building labs. We're building entrepreneurship space with all the same goals that you have. I think Quantum was one of the lucky ones. Has already gone through. I think still the uncertainty was shocking, but certainly for us, the federal funding has held up. The administration's pretty bullish on that specific domain. Yeah.
Can I say one more thing on this that you both just drew out is it is interesting to see the government starting to experiment with where research is occurring, meaning that NSF has launched a new initiative called Tech Labs, which is looking at new forms of research institutes. So if you know what DARPA is, these experimental forms of research institutions inside of the federal government, they're now funding what are called like focused research organizations or private ARPAs, private advanced research projects agencies. Why is this important? They're not often inside of universities, or aren't. They are team-based, they are goal-oriented, and they are very translational in nature. So more nimble, less bureaucratic, and are allowing researchers to find pathways to do that groundbreaking research. I just would say for university folks in the room, you should look closely at that, because the more we start funding research outside of university campuses, it will be interesting to see where talent goes.
And really cool to see that translational piece cooked in from the start, right? Like, I think that's such an important part of that. Two other things maybe I put on the menu. One is in philanthropy, again, a bunch of castles, a lot of moats. How do we bring it together? Arnold Ventures and other big philanthropies have thought about more thesis-driven, pooled funding opportunities. So really looking at a specific question or a specific domain and thinking about how can you pull together a shared interest across different philanthropies, which usually come at these with different equities. For example, around tutoring, there's an organization called Accelerate that has pulled together, I think, $30, $40, $50 million in the development of different models, to test the different models, and then to think about how to scale in multiple districts. that's something that it's not rocket science to bring different dollars together, but it's a way to leverage and simplify work in a specific space. And then another thing I'd highlight is some work that we're actually doing in Colorado, Arnold Ventures, called State Partnership for Proven Programs. And the idea here is, how can philanthropy put money on the table to incentivize and push greater investment in more proven programs and in rigorous research? And so we are matching in Colorado up to $10 million. We've been working with Governor Polis on investments in programs that have really demonstrated good results in other places, trying to scale them here in Colorado, and then continuing to test to see if they're delivering the same sorts of results. That idea of how do you take what is a limited pot that any philanthropy has and really try to leverage those dollars is something that I think all philanthropy is thinking about, but we're doing even more. And I would just say a lot of this work, all of the conversation so far has been at the federal level. The action right now is at the state level and at the local level for a lot of this work. That's where there's engagement, that's where there's opportunity for embedding some of the findings of research and testing out new approaches at different levels. And so we're really excited about that.
You know, I think one sort of overarching theme with these grand challenges, thesis-driven investment, it's, you know, we're trying to get very clear on what the outcome is going to be of all this, right? A little bit less, you know, on the abstract side of things. And sort of my observation, you know, at Minds was doing that smashes a lot of different disciplines together when you sort of start there, right? Which is not inherent. And boy, it can be really challenging. I'd just be curious how that's going, the multidisciplinary approach required for, you know, these new challenges and how they're being framed.
Can I give a really concrete example? So I mentioned the BRAIN Initiative briefly. How many of you have heard of the BRAIN Initiative? It's like a more than decade long, I'm personally pretty obsessed with it. And if you're not, it's because you don't have a brain, maybe? I don't know. You probably do, but you, so one of the reasons that initiative was launched, it didn't come from disease groups that were saying, hey, can you solve Alzheimer's? Right? It came from researchers who said, you know, we are like super blocked in understanding the dynamic human brain and how it acts because we do not have the platform tools and technologies, you know, like CRISPR was for gene editing. We don't literally have the observational tools to see what we need to see about the dynamic human brain. That was researchers saying that. They wrote it in a really nerdy paper, and they wrote it across disciplines, nanotechnologists and neurotechnologists, saying, you know, if the federal government invested a bunch of money, we nanotechnologists and those of us who are engineers could actually help those neurotechnologists figure out how to study the dynamic human brain. Over 10 years, we went from 300 million to 400 billion and excuse me, that would be very exciting, 4 billion in research investments. And there are scores and scores of breakthroughs that have occurred in neurotechnology, understanding how our brains work, that are going to game change disease research about the brain because nanotechnologists and other engineers were brought to the table and there was a collaborative process for building that research agenda. So for me, it can work, especially if you ask those disciplines to inform a research agenda together.
I'm going to answer this in a completely different way, Cristin. I love that, but I'm going to go super wonk, but something that I think is really important because your question, Jesus, of this idea of how do we look across different areas and think about what are the outcomes of greatest interest implies the ability to actually measure that and to track that. And so data infrastructure and linking across different data systems, it's like the most boring and the most important. And also right now, really scary because for many of us who have long tried to advocate for data linking, and this means trying to be able to track if a student graduated from high school, in high school, let's say a charter school, were they able to get a job? What did their earnings look like? Did they attend college? And be able to look at those downstream impacts that we really care about that can change life trajectories. We typically, I mean virtually every level of government, don't have the capacity to do this at scale. There's a great example here in Denver, though, called the Denver Social Impact Bond Project. Anybody heard of this? Very cool. This is like the most policy savvy audience. This is so cool. So this was a project that was looking to house homeless people who had been on the streets for a significant amount of time using a housing first model. And it looked for, what was exciting about it was not looking just to see were we able to get people in homes. It was looking whether we're going to be able to keep them stably housed. Are they going to stay out of the criminal justice system? And is it driving lower overall health spending? Wide range of outcomes, but anybody who's working with similar populations know that an intervention ideally is having outcomes across that span. So there's examples of this, Jesus, where we've been able to create those opportunities. There's a forcing mechanism often that will do it to try to, if it's philanthropic dollars or state leadership, that will bring it to the table. But I think it's exciting to think about where those examples can take place so we can look holistically.
You know, it was the social impact bond that you're talking to was one of the most exciting things. Certainly at Prosono, we were like, this is amazing.
Yes.
More of it everywhere. That was a huge win. But, you know, I'd say from here as a very proud Coloradan, it's been hard to replicate those. You know, when you figure out what it takes to get clear on an outcome, all the people have to get involved, all the people have to say yes. They're hard to get across the finish line, you know, and hopefully all this uncertainty drives the forcing function to where we just have more appetite to figure it out, because very, very promising in my perspective.
And Justin is like coming back to this concept of measurement. Our systems are not set up to measure long-term outcomes. Our systems aren't set up that way in government or in universities to agree on what those measures are, or to agree on data sharing, or to agree on long-term and fund long-term evaluation and assessment. Like, we are failing across the board on the systems for that long-term work to assess impact.
Mm-hmm.
So very excited. It looks like our audience has taken to slide, and we have some great questions kind of coming through. I'd like to tackle a couple of them if the panel's up for it. So kind of first question speaks to the uncertainty, right? A lot of these departments getting gutted. You don't know who to call. You call, you know, you get a voicemail. No one calls you back. Mm-hmm. How do you drive? What are strategies for increasing transparency and decision of authority? How do you figure out who's making the decision for you?
You want to start, and then I can follow?
Okay, so it's an ongoing process right now. It really, the scenario of the last 12 months has caused a lot of puzzle solving, and in a great way, perhaps a silver lining. The impact of crisis sometimes is you have to think differently. And so new collaborations amongst new stakeholders who previously didn't really interact, and I'd say specifically certain science advocacy nonprofits, and then certain political organizations, think about political advocacy organizations. We've been reaching each other to find out who is the person in DC who's now in charge of this given project or this given appropriations line. And those discussions have then brought in another person from, organization from left field, which is, there's this industry association, and it turns out the person running that used to work at this university for 15 years before they started with this industry association. I'll mention the industry associations as being where any of you should look to see what industries are relevant for the kind of research you're involved in, because another tone and theme right now with this administration is the business community has, from our perspective, say the most number of doors and more open doors to have conversations in DC to find out who are the decision makers. It just is what it is right now. It's a bit of how do you tangibly describe how science has manifested into society? Is it a company? Is it a job? Is it an entity paying taxes? And if you have answers to that, that helps open the door to find out, okay, who cares in this administration and who should we be talking to? So it's really finding some new strange bedfellows. And there's actually some really positive interactions happening now from people and organizations that didn't talk to each other before.
Okay, so I think Dan's very smart to point out the step to finding out who is doing what is not just to call the person you know in the federal agencies, but to figure out who has leverage with those federal agencies and attempt to go through them for that question. That is a very smart piece of advice. I will say, in talking to a lot of former senior leaders that have emerged from the federal government, career folks that have been there for a long time, you're not wrong if you're feeling confused, because I'm hearing a lot of specific role shifts. So who is doing what in each stage of those decision-making processes? I will note that some of that is transparent. So you're right, Justin, we moved beyond talking about DOGE, but there are guidance documents that show who now is in charge of things like approving payments. And it is not the same person in the federal agency who previously approved your payments in many cases. We've also noted the increasing role of the Office of Management and Budget in many of these decisions. And look, I'm an OMB alumni. It's one of the most wonderful places in the federal government, filled with career feds who know more about how the federal government works than anywhere else. But it is operating in a completely different way than it has in the past in terms of influencing agency decision-making through a variety of modes. So if you're feeling confused, that is to be expected. And yet, you should not stop calling your congresspeople and asking them to help with that problem, or calling your agency program directors. Do not be afraid of calling your point of contact in the agencies. The more of those questions, the more political appointees you can reach, the better. I would also note that there have been a variety of experiments that Congress has put into the law and the new funding bills around protections for federal funding and around some transparency measures. This isn't transparency like call Bob at this number, but it's transparency in terms of how funding is proceeding. And we should watch those experiments and argue for more protections to be placed into appropriations laws that force some consistency on these rules, on this decision making. So I would argue that if you can't get your answer, you should tell Congress that and be specific that top lines are not enough, but you need actual protections and transparency provisions in appropriation law and the accounts you care about, because it will happen on an account by account basis and not government wide. So please use your voice to argue for transparency provisions to Congress.
So I want to shift to philanthropy and its role in this a little bit more. So, as we've heard, I think this, call it people being more careful kind of in research is definitely undermining, I think, a lot of the taproot research that we used to do, right? Which I think done well, what's exciting about it is we see this, I've seen this so much, in our R&D programs. You start out with a big idea, maybe it's a hydrogen fuel cell, and some graduate student invents an algorithm to map, electrochemical fuel cells 60 times faster than is commercially available today, right? These things, they create such a wake and so much value tied to them. Justin, I'd be curious, how is philanthropy looking at that? Are they saying, this is our time, we can take our risk-based capital and be the one that steps in there? But I'd also want to just see, how has the grantee profile changed, in your mind?
Yeah. Candidly, it's hard to talk about philanthropy as a whole because one philanthropy. And I really like to keep going back to the castle. It really kind of is that. And they're self-contained. So it really depends. You've seen some philanthropies like MacArthur Foundation has really leaned in, and I think they've committed significantly more dollars. Marguerite Casey Foundation is another that's committed significantly more program dollars to help support organizations that have been directly impacted by not just research cuts, but by program cuts from government. And I've alluded to other organizations that have pulled back in some areas, particularly around climate. I think there's been more high-profile cutbacks there. What we've done at Arnold Ventures has been to lean in. And, part of the question, I think, underlying this is how much can philanthropy bridge the gap of this pullback? And I think it is not to any significant degree for all of the organizations. And I think we viewed this time as an important, as the chance to signal to the field and to the research community that we continue to deeply value and want to double down on the research investments that we've made. So my team in particular, we've doubled the research investments that we made over the last year. We're ramping up this year as well through our open RFPs. And so that's at least been drops in the bucket. It has been, it's not something that I think has radically changed our grantee profiles yet, but I will say that we are, as Cristin alluded to, one of the, I think, earliest findings right now on if the cuts haven't been so dramatic that the number of grants going out the door has been significantly lower from NSF and NIH, and that has hit early career researchers the hardest. And so we've thought about how can we preference that, how can we make that a part of the process, and even build a mentorship into some of the larger grants that we do that try to partner early career researchers with more established researchers.
Great. With each philanthropy running their own play, right? They can have their own agendas. Let's assume we were to be able to get them to take on grand challenges, these thesis-driven programs, and we were able to drive tons of alignment kind of tied to them. I'd be curious what anyone, and open to anybody, how are they going to be able to fill the gap? Like how effective, how far would that get us?
I don't believe there's a replacement for federal funding for research, period.
By like exponential amounts. So we are going into some version of new normal, notwithstanding, say, the recent appropriations that were approved that weren't as high double-digit percentage cuts as were proposed, but the ripple effect of the last year is going to cause new, let's stay on the positive side, new collaborations, new kind of stakeholders meeting together and having, let's take the best parts of what might be called business mindset and outcomes and metrics, KPIs for scientific investment. Let's bring in some more of those real world checks, that perspective that says, all right, when do we see some ROI? And what are the ROI metrics we're looking for? That is coming into and is already now in many of these conversations around science funding. And one way of looking at this is that it's a necessary and good evolution for us. You can look at this from more of a dark side of we're defunding our own country's brilliance, and there are global competitors who are happy to watch us struggle and churn right now. That's a different panel. But let's, look for, and I'll ask each of you to remember you're all obviously involved in science and technology and research from one angle or another. And in each of you, back to when you were 5 years old and you saw like how a dump truck worked, or you learned about a dinosaur, or you just wondered how birds fly, etc. That core of curiosity, and we're going to hear more about this from Scott, not trying to take that away. Tap into that. That is some of the fuel to get through what is also right now some real heavy and uncertain times. But the curiosity of, okay, so now what? How are we going to solve this puzzle? There are some answers to it, and they're new and not certain, but let's keep finding these new collaborations with new stakeholders, because the money is out there, but not in the formats and the overall structures that we've gotten used to over some decades.
Great. So we've only got a few minutes left. I want to kind of see if we can tie a bow on this with a $1 billion question, right? And so I think maybe part if you could weave in your final answers here is just one, what does good look like right now, right? What is an efficient and impactful, ecosystem look like? But two, let's say hypothetically, if you could move $1 billion into an innovation ecosystem today, where would it go? Why? And most importantly, how would you deploy it to ensure maximum impact?
Okay. So what I have a weird perspective in which I get to work on federal issues, so $1 billion is actually not very much money in terms of systems change. And so I would say two things. One is that I believe, and we could do a whole sidebar at lunch about this, that we need a greater diversity of funding mechanisms, meaning grants and contracts are only one way the federal government can give out dollars. And there are lots of pay for performance based approaches. And so I think if I only had $1 billion to deploy, I would be trying to pay for outcomes. And we can talk more about what that looks like in practice. If I only had $1 billion to deploy and I was not funding research directly, I would instead be funding groups to actually put forward more clear recommendations on what the ideal research system looks like. The number one takeaway I had from my time in the federal government is we should be more expansive in our views of what is fixed and what is changeable, because the systems in which we exist were built by people. And yet, when I ask senior research leaders, I get very unclear answers on what they want to come behind this disruption, on how it should look. And maybe that's because they're so busy fighting the fire today and not resourced to actually write and plan together for what actually should exist. And I'm talking bolder than we might get from a National Academy's consensus-driven report, right? I'm talking about putting forward bold ideas about how the system might look. So I'd go one of those two directions.
All right. Okay, yeah, so real quick, a whole different direction. There's over 300 federally funded research labs in the country. If you're not familiar with the Federal Laboratory Consortium, FLC, check that organization out. They do at a national scale some of what we look to do at CoLabs. But with that network of over 300 labs, I would look to identify 5 or 6 key technologies that are already shaping and are going to continue shaping our life going forward. So that's in the realm of climate tech, robotics, bioscience, perhaps some climate science mitigation technologies. So with those 6 themes, then I would pick 30 or 40 cities or locations around the country that have relevant labs that are doing research in that realm, and then design K through 12 field trip programs to bring kids into those labs and actually see what's going on inside those labs. Meet the scientists who are working on it, who can describe, here's what I'm working on, here's what you're already using today, kids. Ponch referencing like the phone in our pocket, and the idea that people may not even know the taproot of where that came from. Let's get kids understanding where the solutions and technologies they use already and are going to be using, to understand where they come from.
Yeah, love it. I'm gonna build. I think mine's in the vicinity of Cristin's, and it's crazy when $1 billion is just $1 billion, but $1 billion is just $1 billion. So I want to bridge the conversation from the first panel earlier in the importance of being able to make a case and tell stories about impact in ways that feel meaningful to people, and that they can see in a short-term way. Well, short-term meaning matter of years instead of decades. And so I would love to launch a replication challenge. So I would love to use the grand challenge model. I think that's incredibly effective. I think I would love for states to compete to identify a model or two that's been really demonstrated to a high degree and look at scaling it up with fidelity within a state or maybe a large city, and say, we're going to give you a significant number of dollars to do this. You're going to show us how you're going to help to build the capacity to actually implement this. We're going to provide some of the technical assistance to do so. You're going to create a long-term plan for what sustainable funding might look like, and we're going to bring research alongside that develops the metrics, the measures, and the tracking to be able to demonstrate what this looks like. So you could imagine this for tutoring. There's a couple of tutoring programs that have demonstrated wildly successful outcomes for middle school math. You could imagine this for a couple of workforce training programs. Deep investment for people who could who are struggling to get jobs, try to bridge that gap and look at what the earnings outcomes look like. That could be a 5-year process. You'll start to see some real outcomes, and to me would be something that could be tangible and meaningful and demonstrate how research and policy and practice can align in order to really change life trajectories.
Great. Well, first of all, how about a round of applause for our great guest? Yeah, wonderful conversation. I think we solved maybe half of the world's problems, not all of them, in 1 hour. Not bad.
You got another billion we could brainstorm?
Yeah, I should have had a bigger number in that question, I guess. Right? Right, Cristin?